In the grand halls of Thornfield Manor, a priceless sapphire ring, steeped in scandal and history, vanishes during a glittering dinner party. The suspects, a proud colonel, a charming widow, a cunning jeweler, and a desperate maid. As accusations fly and secrets unravel, Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and piercing gaze, navigates a web of greed, loyalty, and deception. Who stole the ring, and what truths lie hidden in its sparkling depths? Step into a classic mystery, where every glance hides a motive, and only one mind can uncover the truth. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Thornfield Manor. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary's Mead, its light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. She sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl, her fingers moving with the ease of long habit. On the table beside her lay an envelope, its crisp cream paper bearing the crest of Thornfield Manor. The invitation within, penned in Colonel Henry Banbury's meticulous hand, had arrived that morning, stirring a ripple of curiosity in Miss Marple's sharp mind. The colonel, a widower of some repute, was known in the village for his military precision and his passion for collecting antiques. His latest acquisition, a sapphire ring from the Regency era, was the talk of St. Mary's Mead. Whispers in the post office and the tea shop spoke of its storied past, once worn by a duchess whose love affair had scandalized the ton. The invitation promised a small dinner party to showcase this treasure, with Miss Marple among the select guests. She adjusted her spectacles, her lips curving into a faint smile. Such gatherings, she knew, often revealed more than their hosts intended. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm. The baker's boy cycled past, whistling, and Mrs. Price from the vicarage hurried by with a basket of apples. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the garden, where her roses bloomed in orderly rows, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The guest list intrigued her. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widow with a penchant for bright silks and brighter laughter, was a frequent visitor to Thornfield Manor, her charm a subject of village gossip. Mr. Edgar Poole, a London jeweler, had arrived the previous day, his presence noted by the curious eyes of St. Mary's Mead. Then there was Ellen Carter, the colonel's maid, a quiet girl whose reserved demeanor hid a story Miss Marple had yet to unravel. She set her knitting aside and picked up the invitation again, tracing the embossed crest with a finger. Colonel Banbury's pride in his collection was no secret, but pride, Miss Marple mused, often walked hand in hand with folly. The ring, with its whispered history of betrayal, seemed to her a magnet for trouble. She recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute, where Mrs. Winthrop had spoken of the ring with a gleam in her eye, and Mr. Poole, overheard at the pub, had mentioned its value with a calculating air. Even Ellen, fetching tea for the colonel, had paused when the ring was mentioned, her face unreadable. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and crossed to the window. The village lay serene, but she sensed an undercurrent, like the faint tremor before a storm. She had attended many such dinners, each a stage for human nature to play its part, greed, envy, or desperation often lurking behind polite smiles. Tucking the invitation into her knitting basket, she resolved to observe closely. The sapphire ring, she suspected, would draw out secrets as surely as her questions drew out truths. As evening approached, Miss Marple donned her best black dress, pinning a cameo brooch at her collar. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, picked up her sturdy umbrella, more for habit than necessity, and stepped into the dusk. The walk to Thornfield Manor was short, the path winding past hedgerows and the village church. The manor loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by ivy, its windows aglow with promise. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with excitement, but with the quiet thrill of anticipation. Whatever secrets the ring held, she would find them out. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The gravel drive of Thornfield Manor crunched under Miss Jane Marple's sensible shoes as she approached the imposing front door, its oak polished to a gleam that reflected the last rays of the setting sun. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves, and the manor's windows glowed with the promise of warmth and intrigue. Colonel Henry Banbury himself opened the door, his tall frame rigid in a tailored dinner jacket, his mustache bristling with military precision. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, his voice a blend of courtesy and command, as he ushered her into the hall. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, betrayed a flicker of pride. Tonight was no ordinary dinner, and he knew it. The hall of Thornfield Manor was a testament to the colonel's obsession with the past. A suit of armor stood sentinel by the staircase, its visor glinting in the chandelier's light, while a Persian rug softened the stone floor. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the details. A gilt-framed portrait of a stern ancestor, a mahogany table bearing a silver cigarette case, and a faint scent of beeswax polish that spoke of meticulous care. She handed her shawl and umbrella to a young footman, noting his nervous glance toward the drawing room, where voices already murmured. "Allow me to escort you," the colonel said, leading her through an arched doorway into the drawing room. The space was grand, yet intimate, its walls lined with damask paper and shelves of leather-bound books. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled guests. Miss Marple's eyes, keen behind her spectacles, took in the scene with the quiet intensity of a painter studying a canvas. Each figure, she knew, was a piece in a puzzle yet to be assembled. Mrs. Clara Winthrop stood by the window, her emerald silk gown catching the firelight as she laughed at some remark of her own. Her auburn hair, swept into an elegant chignon, gleamed with calculated allure, and her fingers, adorned with a single pearl ring, gestured animatedly. She was a woman of perhaps 40, her vivacity undimmed by widowhood, though village gossip whispered of debts left by her late husband. Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Winthrop's eyes darted to the colonel, her smile a touch too bright, as if seeking to anchor his attention. Across the room, Mr. Edgar Poole, the jeweler, examined a silver candlestick on the mantelpiece, his wiry frame bent slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. His suit, though well cut, bore the faint wear of frequent use, and his fingers moved with the precision of one accustomed to handling delicate gems. His presence in St. Mary's Mead was unusual. He had arrived only yesterday, ostensibly to appraise the colonel's collection, but Miss Marple suspected his interest lay primarily in the sapphire ring. His thin lips curved into a polite smile as he caught her eye, but the gesture did not reach his calculating gaze. Ellen Carter, the colonel's maid, moved silently through the room, her black uniform crisp and her auburn hair tucked beneath a white cap. She carried a tray of sherry glasses, her movements graceful but mechanical, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Her face, pale and unremarkable, betrayed a flicker of unease when she met Miss Marple's glance. The old lady's memory stirred. Ellen was the daughter of a local farmer, a quiet girl who had taken service at the manor after her father's death. Village talk hinted at a brother in London, a ne'er-do-well with a taste for cards, but Ellen herself was an enigma, her reserve a shield Miss Marple longed to pierce. The centerpiece of the room, placed on a rosewood table near the fire, was the sapphire ring, displayed on a velvet cushion beneath a glass dome. Its deep blue stone, the size of a robin's egg, caught the light in a way that seemed to draw every eye. The diamonds encircling it sparkled like stars, and the gold setting bore the patina of age. The colonel, standing beside it, launched into its history with the fervor of a man unveiling a trophy. "Worn by the Duchess of Claremont in 1812, he declared, his voice resonating with pride. A gift from her lover, a naval officer, before he perished at Trafalgar. The scandal, they say, nearly ruined her." Mrs. Winthrop clapped her hands, her laugh a cascade of notes. "Oh, Colonel, how romantic! A ring with such a story must be priceless." Her eyes lingered on the sapphire, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her fingers, as if resisting the urge to reach for it. Mr. Poole stepped closer, his spectacles glinting as he peered at the ring. "Exquisite craftsmanship," he murmured, his tone professional but edged with something deeper. Hunger, perhaps. "The cut is early Georgian, and the clarity of the sapphire is remarkable. I'd wager it's worth more than most of your collection combined, Colonel." The colonel's chest puffed slightly, though his eyes narrowed at the jeweler. "I trust your appraisal, Poole, but I've no intention of selling. This ring is the jewel of Thornfield Manor." His words carried a challenge, as if daring anyone to question his stewardship. Ellen, setting a glass of sherry on the table, fumbled slightly, the crystal clinking against the wood. The colonel's gaze snapped to her, his mustache twitching with irritation. "Careful, girl," he said sharply, and Ellen flushed, murmuring an apology as she retreated to the edge of the room. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her reticule, seemed to itch for use. She longed to sit and knit, letting her thoughts untangle as her fingers worked. Instead, she accepted a sherry and settled into a wing-back chair, her position offering a clear view of the room. The conversation turned to village matters, the harvest festival, the new vicar's sermons, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the undercurrents. Mrs. Winthrop's laughter rang out again, this time at a jest about the colonel's military campaigns, but her eyes flicked to the ring with a frequency that belied her casual air. Mr. Poole, now engaged in a discussion of gem markets, spoke with a clipped precision that suggested ambition beyond his modest shop. Ellen, refilling glasses, moved with a quiet that felt deliberate, as if she wished to vanish into the wallpaper. The colonel, presiding over the group, seemed oblivious to the tensions, his focus fixed on the ring and its glory. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill she felt, not from the room, but from the atmosphere. The ring, she sensed, was more than a bauble. It was a catalyst, stirring desires and fears in those around it. She recalled a similar case years ago, a stolen brooch at a country house where greed had unraveled a family. Here the stakes felt higher, the players more guarded. As the butler announced dinner, the party moved to the dining room, a cavernous space with a long oak table set with silver and crystal. The ring was left on its cushion, the glass dome glinting in the firelight. Miss Marple, trailing behind, noted how each guest glanced back at it. Mrs. Winthrop with a wistful smile, Mr. Poole with a furrowed brow. Ellen with a fleeting look of dread. The colonel, locking the drawing-room door behind them, seemed satisfied that his treasure was secure. Miss Marple, however, was not so certain. The dining room was a study in opulence, its chandelier casting prisms across the walls, its table laden with roast pheasant, glazed carrots, and a decanter of claret that glowed like the ring itself. The colonel took his place at the head, his bearing that of a general at a war council. Mrs. Winthrop, seated to his right, leaned close to complement the table setting, her voice a purr that made the colonel's cheeks redden. Mr. Poole, opposite her, ate sparingly, his eyes darting to the locked drawing-room door. Ellen served with silent efficiency, her presence barely noticed except by Miss Marple, who saw the girl's hands tremble as she poured the wine. Conversation flowed, but it was punctuated by silences that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mrs. Winthrop regaled the table with tales of her travels in Italy, her anecdotes laced with flirtatious glances at the colonel. "You must visit Florence, Colonel," she said, touching his arm. "The art, the history. It would suit a man of your taste." Her words were light, but Miss Marple caught the calculation in her smile, as if she were casting a net. Mr. Poole, less adept at charm, steered the talk to gems, his voice sharp with expertise. "The sapphire market is volatile," he said, cutting his pheasant with precision. "A stone like yours, Colonel, could fetch a fortune in London, but only to the right buyer." His tone was neutral, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped his fork, as if holding back a deeper intent. The colonel, warming to the topic, boasted of his collection's provenance, his voice rising with pride. "I've spent years curating these pieces," he said, gesturing to a pair of Ming vases on a sideboard. "Each has a story, but none like the ring. It's a legacy, not a commodity." His eyes flicked to Mr. Poole, a warning in their depths. Ellen, clearing plates, dropped a spoon with a clatter that drew every eye. "Sorry, sir," she murmured, her face scarlet as she bent to retrieve it. The colonel's frown deepened, and Mrs. Winthrop's lips curved in a faint, amused smile. Miss Marple, watching Ellen, saw not just embarrassment, but a flicker of fear, as if the girl sensed the weight of scrutiny. As dessert was served, a delicate lemon soufflé, the conversation turned to the ring's history again. The colonel, emboldened by the claret, recounted the Duchess's scandal with relish, his voice carrying to the far end of the table. "Her lover's name was etched inside the band," he said, "though it's worn faint now. A tragic tale, but it adds to the ring's allure." Mrs. Winthrop sighed dramatically, her hand brushing the colonel's as she reached for her glass. Mr. Poole's eyes narrowed, and Ellen, pouring coffee, seemed to shrink further into herself. Miss Marple, eating her soufflé with small, precise bites, let her mind wander over the scene. The ring, she thought, was like a mirror, reflecting the desires of those who gazed upon it. Mrs. Winthrop's flirtations suggested a woman seeking security, perhaps through the colonel's wealth. Mr. Poole's interest in the ring was professional, but his strained demeanor hinted at personal stakes. Ellen's nervousness could be mere shyness, but Miss Marple suspected a deeper burden, perhaps tied to the brother rumored to be in trouble. As the meal ended, the colonel rose, his face flushed with wine and pride. "Shall we return to the drawing-room?" he said. "I'll show you the ring up close. It's only right to appreciate such a piece." The guests murmured agreement, and Miss Marple followed, her heart quickening with the sense that the evening was about to shift. The ring, locked away, yet ever present, seemed to cast a shadow over the group, its sapphire heart pulsing with secrets yet to be uncovered. In the drawing room, the colonel unlocked the door with a flourish, revealing the ring still on its cushion, the glass dome untouched. He lifted the dome, his movements reverent, and passed the ring to Mrs. Winthrop, who cooed over its sparkle. Mr. Poole took it next, weighing it in his palm with a jeweler's eye. Ellen, tasked with returning it to the cushion, held it briefly, her fingers trembling. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, watched each exchange, her mind cataloging every glance, every gesture. The air felt charged, as if the ring itself whispered of betrayal. Then, as the colonel turned to answer a question from Mrs. Winthrop, a gasp shattered the moment. Mrs. Winthrop pointed to the cushion, her face a mask of shock. "The ring! It's gone!" The velvet was empty. The sapphire vanished. The colonel's face reddened, his voice a roar. "What's this? Who's taken it?" The room erupted in confusion, and Miss Marple, her sherry untouched, felt the puzzle snap into focus. The storm had broken, and she would find the truth in its wake. Chapter 3. The Vanishing. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor, moments ago a stage for polite admiration, now hummed with a discordant energy, like a violin strung too tight. The empty velvet cushion, where the sapphire ring had rested under its glass dome, seemed to mock the gathered company. Colonel Henry Banbury's face was a study in fury, his mustache quivering as he glared at the barren spot. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the damask walls. "That ring is worth a fortune, and I'll have answers, now." Mrs. Clara Winthrop, her emerald gown shimmering as she clutched her throat, was the picture of dismay. "It was right there," she gasped, her eyes wide, though Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire, noted a certain theatricality in her posture, as if she were playing to an audience. Mr. Edgar Poole, the jeweler, stood rigid, his spectacles glinting as he scanned the room, his thin lips pressed into a line. Ellen Carter, the maid, shrank back against the bookshelves, her pale face half hidden by her cap, her hands twisting in her apron. Miss Marple, her sherry glass untouched on the side table, observed them all, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles tucked in her reticule. The colonel strode to the table, his boots thumping on the Persian rug, and inspected the cushion as if the ring might materialize under his glare. "It was here not 5 minutes ago," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "One of you handled it last. Who was it?" His eyes darted to Ellen, who flinched as if struck. I only put it back, sir," Ellen stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I placed it on the cushion, just as you asked." Her eyes, wide with fear, flicked to the floor, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her fingers, a sign of more than simple nervousness. Mrs. Winthrop stepped forward, her silk rustling. "Well, it's gone now, and we were all here," she said, her tone edged with accusation. "Perhaps it was a thief from outside. Those French windows were open earlier, weren't they?" She gestured toward the tall windows that led to the terrace, their curtains swaying slightly in the evening breeze. The colonel's frown deepened. "Nonsense, Clara. The lawn's damp from this morning's rain. No footprints, no sign of intrusion. I checked myself before dinner." He turned to Mr. Poole, his gaze narrowing. "You, Poole, you had your hands on it. A jeweler like you would know its value better than anyone." Mr. Poole's face remained impassive, though his fingers tightened briefly on the stem of his sherry glass. "I examined it, yes, as you requested," he said coolly. But I returned it to the cushion. Perhaps you should ask your maid. She was the last to touch it." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker of calculation in his eyes, as if he were steering the conversation with care. Ellen's cheeks flushed scarlet. "I didn't take it, sir. I swear," she cried, her voice breaking. "I only did as I was told." Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted how she avoided looking at the cushion, as if it held some guilty secret. "Enough of this," the colonel snapped. "No one leaves this house until that ring is found. I'm calling Higgs." He strode to the telephone on a side table, his movements jerky with anger, and summoned Constable Higgs, the local policeman whose plodding methods were well known in St. Mary's Mead. As he barked orders into the receiver, the room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple, her hands folded calmly in her lap, let her gaze drift over the scene. The room, with its polished elegance, seemed to close in, the air thick with suspicion. The French windows, as Mrs. Winthrop had suggested, were a possible entry point, but the colonel's point about the lawn was sound. No muddy tracks marred the terrace. The ring had vanished in a moment of distraction, when the colonel had turned to answer Mrs. Winthrop's question about his military campaigns. That moment, Miss Marple thought, was the key, but the puzzle was far from complete. Constable Higgs arrived within the hour, his round face flushed from the brisk walk up the drive. A stout man with a notebook, perpetually in hand, he was earnest but lacked imagination, a fact Miss Marple had noted during a minor theft at the vicarage some years back. He surveyed the room with a solemn air, as if the weight of the manor's grandeur pressed upon him. "Right then," he said, clearing his throat. "Let's have the facts. Colonel, when did you last see the ring?" The colonel recounted the evening, the ring's display, its passing among the guests, and its return to the cushion by Ellen. "It was there when we went to dinner," he said, "and locked in this room. We returned, I lifted the dome, and we passed it round again. Then, gone." His voice trembled with indignation, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands clenched, as if he longed to seize the thief himself. Higgs turned to Mrs. Winthrop, who stood fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "Mrs. Winthrop, you raised the alarm. What did you see?" "I was standing right here," she said, positioning herself near the table, her movements graceful but deliberate. "The colonel was telling us about his time in India, and I glanced at the cushion. Habit, you know, to admire such a lovely thing. It was empty. I couldn't believe it." Her voice rose, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, though Miss Marple observed that her eyes remained dry. "And you, Mr. Poole?" Higgs asked, turning to the jeweler, who had seated himself on a velvet settee, his posture composed. "I handled the ring briefly," Mr. Poole said, his tone measured. "I noted its weight and clarity. Exceptional, as I told the colonel. I gave it to Ellen to place back. After that, I was by the fireplace, discussing gem cuts with Mrs. Winthrop." His account was precise, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's mind filed away the detail. He had distanced himself from the table at the critical moment. Higgs approached Ellen, who stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly. "Miss Carter, you were the last to touch it. What's your story?" Ellen's voice was barely audible. "I took it from Mr. Poole and put it on the cushion, sir. I didn't do anything else, I swear. I was over there." She pointed to the corner near the bookshelves. When Mrs. Winthrop cried out, her eyes darted to the floor, and Miss Marple saw a bead of sweat on her brow, despite the coolness of the room. Higgs scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. "Right, we'll search the room first. No one moves." He began a methodical inspection, peering under furniture, lifting cushions, and tapping the walls for hidden panels. The guests watched in tense silence, their faces a gallery of emotions. The Colonel's anger, Mrs. Winthrop's feigned distress, Mr. Poole's guarded calm, and Ellen's barely concealed panic. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her eyes flitting from one to another, her mind weaving a tapestry of possibilities. The search yielded nothing, no ring, no trace of its passage. The glass dome, Higgs noted, was free of smudges, as if it had been wiped clean, a detail that struck Miss Marple as significant. A thief in a hurry would not pause to polish glass, yet a careful one might. She glanced at Ellen, whose duties included cleaning, but dismissed the thought for now. Too obvious, and Miss Marple distrusted the obvious. Higgs, wiping his brow, turned to the Colonel. "Sir, I'll need to search the guests' belongings, with your permission, and the staff's quarters." The Colonel nodded curtly, his face a storm cloud. Ellen let out a small gasp, quickly stifled, and Mrs. Winthrop raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching as if amused. Mr. Poole's expression did not change, but his fingers drummed once, briefly, on the arm of the settee. As Higgs organized the search, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. "If I may, Colonel," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I suggest we ensure no one leaves the manor tonight? It would be prudent until the ring is found." Her tone was deferential, but her eyes were sharp, and the Colonel, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. "Very well," he said. "Everyone stays." Higgs locked the doors. The constable nodded, and the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind racing. The ring's disappearance was no accident, she was certain. Someone had seized a moment of distraction, but who? Mrs. Winthrop's theatrics suggested a performance, perhaps to deflect suspicion. Mr. Poole's calm was too studied, his knowledge of gems a potential motive. Ellen's fear was palpable, but whether from guilt or something else, Miss Marple could not yet say. And the Colonel himself, his fury seemed genuine, but pride could mask many things. As the fire dwindled, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a mystery unfolding. The ring was gone, but its absence had revealed something else. The hidden currents of desire, fear, and deceit that ran through Thornfield Manor. She would watch and listen, and in time, the truth would surface, as it always did. Chapter 4. The Accusations. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor, once a haven of genteel conversation, now felt like a courtroom, its air thick with suspicion and the faint crackle of the dying fire. Colonel Henry Banbury stood by the rosewood table, his face a thundercloud, the empty velvet cushion a silent accusation against all present. The sapphire ring's disappearance had shattered the evening's decorum, and the guests, confined by the Colonel's order to remain, shifted uneasily under the weight of mutual distrust. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her wing-back chair, her hands folded over her reticule, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a chess player studying the board. Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Not the quiver of Mrs. Clara Winthrop's fan, nor the rigid set of Mr. Edgar Poole's shoulders, nor the way Ellen Carter's fingers knotted in her apron. Constable Higgs, his notebook clutched like a talisman, stood in the center of the room, his round face flushed with the effort of maintaining authority in such august company. "Right then," he said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "We've searched the room and found nothing. I'll need statements from each of you, and I'll ask you to be honest. That ring didn't walk off on its own." His attempt at firmness faltered as he met the colonel's glare, and he cleared his throat, flipping open his notebook. The colonel, his mustache bristling, was the first to speak, his words clipped and sharp. "This is a disgrace, Higgs. That ring is a family treasure, worth more than you'd see in a lifetime. It was here, under lock and key, until we returned from dinner. Someone in this room took it, and I'll not rest until they're found out." His eyes swept over the guests, lingering on Ellen, who shrank further into the shadows by the bookshelves. Mrs. Winthrop, fanning herself with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, stepped forward, her emerald gown catching the firelight. "Really, Colonel, it's dreadful," she said, her voice trembling with what might have been shock, or a skillful imitation of it. "But surely you don't suspect us. I was standing right here, admiring the ring, when it vanished. Anyone could have slipped in through those French windows. They were open earlier, weren't they?" Her eyes flicked to the tall windows, their curtains still, the terrace beyond cloaked in darkness. The colonel's jaw tightened. "I told you, Clara, there are no footprints on the lawn. The ground's sodden from this morning's rain, and the terrace is clean. No outsider came through those windows." His tone was final, but Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his hand as he gestured, a sign of nerves beneath his bluster. Mr. Poole, seated on the velvet settee, adjusted his spectacles with deliberate calm. "If I may, Colonel," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "The maid was the last to handle the ring. She placed it on the cushion, did she not? And she had access to the room all evening." His words were measured, but their implication hung heavy, and Ellen let out a small, choked sound. "I didn't take it, sir," Ellen cried, her voice breaking as she stepped forward, her pale face blotched with red. "I put it back, just as I was told. I'd never steal from the colonel." Her eyes, wide with desperation, darted to Miss Marple, as if seeking an ally. But the old lady remained silent, her expression one of gentle concern. Higgs scribbled furiously, his pencil scratching against the page. "Miss Carter, you're certain you placed it on the cushion? Did you see anyone else near it after?" Ellen nodded, her cap slipping slightly. "Yes, sir. I put it down, and then I went to fetch the coffee tray. I was over there." She pointed to the corner by the fireplace. When Mrs. Winthrop cried out, her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands twisted, as if trying to wring out her fear. The constable turned to Mrs. Winthrop, who raised her chin, her fan pausing mid-motion. "Mrs. Winthrop, you say you saw the cushion was empty. Were you watching the ring the whole time?" "Not every second," she admitted, her tone airy but her eyes sharp. "I was speaking with the colonel about his time in India. Such fascinating stories. But I glanced at the cushion, and it was bare. I couldn't believe my eyes." She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, and Miss Marple observed the slight quiver of her fingers, wondering if it was genuine or part of the performance. Mr. Poole leaned forward, his gaze steady. "If I might point out, Constable, the maid had ample opportunity. She's in and out of this room all day, polishing, tidying. Who's to say she didn't slip it into her apron earlier and stage this little drama? His tone was reasonable, but Miss Marple caught the glint of calculation in his eyes, as if he were casting a net to snare another. Ellen's face crumpled, tears welling. "That's not true. I'd never do such a thing," she protested, but her voice was drowned by the Colonel's roar. "Enough!" he thundered, slamming his fist on the table. "I won't have my household slandered, but nor will I tolerate theft. Higgs, search their rooms, everyone's, and the staff quarters test, quarters, now." His command brooked no argument, and Higgs nodded, though his expression suggested he dreaded the task. As the constable organized the footman and butler to assist in the search, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her mind sifting through the accusations like threads in a tapestry. The room was a cauldron of motives. Mrs. Winthrop's suggestion of an outside thief felt convenient, a deflection from her own proximity to the ring. Mr. Poole's quickness to point at Ellen was too eager, his knowledge of gems a potential key to his interest. Ellen's distress was palpable, but whether it stemmed from guilt or fear of being falsely accused, Miss Marple could not yet discern. The Colonel's fury seemed genuine, but his insistence on locking the manor suggested a deeper stake in the ring's recovery, perhaps more than pride. Higgs returned after a thorough search of the guests' rooms and the staff's quarters, his face glum. "Nothing, sir," he reported to the Colonel. "No ring, no tools, no sign of it anywhere." The news deepened the tension, and Miss Marple noted the reactions. Mrs. Winthrop's fan fluttered faster, Mr. Poole's fingers stilled on the settee's arm, and Ellen's shoulders sagged, as if relieved yet still frightened. The Colonel paced, his boots thudding on the rug. "This is intolerable," he muttered. "Someone here is a thief, and I'll see them in irons." His eyes flicked to Ellen, then to Mr. Poole, and even briefly to Mrs. Winthrop, who met his gaze with a defiant tilt of her head. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "Colonel, if I might suggest we should consider the timing. The ring vanished in a moment of distraction when you were speaking with Mrs. Winthrop. Whoever took it was quick and clever, but they may still be among us." Her words were gentle, but they sharpened the room's edge, and she felt the eyes of all upon her, wary and assessing. Higgs nodded, though his expression was one of a man out of his depth. "I'll question the staff again tomorrow," he said. "For now, no one leaves, as Miss Marple suggested. We'll reconvene in the morning." The Colonel grunted his approval, and the guests were shown to their rooms, the manor's doors locked as if it were a fortress under siege. As Miss Marple ascended the grand staircase to her guest room, her mind turned over the evening's events. The clean glass dome nagged at her, a detail too precise for a panicked theft. Mrs. Winthrop's theatricality, Mr. Poole's calculated accusations, Ellen's fear, and the Colonel's paranoia, all wove into a pattern. But it was incomplete. She thought of a similar case in St. Mary's Mead, where a stolen locket had revealed a web of jealousy. Here, the sapphire ring was a brighter lure, its value a magnet for greed or desperation. Settling into her room, the faint creak of the manor's timbers. Her only companion, Miss Marple, knew the truth was close, waiting to be unraveled by her patient, piercing mind. Chapter 5. The Maid's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Thornfield Manor, casting a muted glow across the breakfast room, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her teacup cradled in her hands. The table, set with fine china and silver, bore the remnants of a modest meal: scones, marmalade, and a pot of strong tea. But the atmosphere was far from convivial. The sapphire ring's disappearance hung over the household like a storm cloud, and the locked doors of the manor only deepened the sense of confinement. Colonel Henry Banbury, at the head of the table, glowered over his untouched plate, his mustache drooping with the weight of his indignation. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, in a morning dress of lavender silk, buttered a scone with affected nonchalance, while Mr. Edgar Poole, his spectacles glinting, read the morning paper with an air of detachment. Ellen Carter, the maid, was absent, her duties confined to the kitchen under the colonel's stern orders. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, sipped her tea and let her thoughts drift. The events of the previous night, the ring's vanishing, the accusations, the fruitless search, had revealed much about the players in this drama. Mrs. Winthrop's quick suggestion of an outside thief had been too convenient, her dramatics a touch too polished. Mr. Poole's eagerness to point the finger had Ellen suggested a man deflecting attention, his knowledge of gems a potential motive. Ellen's tearful denials had rung true, yet there was a shadow in her demeanor, a hint of something unspoken. The colonel's fury, while understandable, carried a note of paranoia that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. She set her teacup down, her mind weaving the threads of suspicion into a pattern. Determined to gather more pieces of the puzzle, Miss Marple excused herself from the table, citing a desire to admire the manor's gardens. The colonel grunted his approval, distracted by a letter from his solicitor, while Mrs. Winthrop offered a bright smile that did not reach her eyes. Mr. Poole merely nodded, his gaze lingering on Miss Marple as if assessing her intentions. She stepped into the crisp morning air, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path that wound through the rose garden. The blooms, heavy with dew, nodded in the breeze, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the laundry yard, where Ellen was hanging linens on a clothesline, her movements slow and deliberate. Ellen's auburn hair, freed from her cap, caught the sunlight as she pinned a sheet, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle demeanor, her umbrella tapping lightly on the ground. "Good morning, Ellen," she said, her voice warm but probing. "The roses are lovely, aren't they? Though I dare say you've enough work without tending to flowers." Ellen started, nearly dropping a clothespin, and turned to face Miss Marple, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, the roses are fine, but I've my duties to keep me busy." She resumed her task, her hands shaking as she reached for another sheet. Miss Marple, settling onto a nearby bench, adjusted her shawl and studied the girl. "It must be difficult, working in such a grand house, with all this trouble over the ring," she said, her tone conversational, but her eyes keen. "I imagine it weighs on you, being suspected so unfairly." Ellen's hands froze, and she bit her lip, her gaze fixed on the linen. "I didn't take it, miss," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'd never do such a thing to the colonel. He's been good to me, even if he's strict." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the manor, as if fearing eavesdroppers. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But it's natural to feel frightened when accusations fly. I've seen it before, you know, in my village. A girl like you, with family to think of, it can be a burden." She paused, letting the words settle, and saw Ellen's shoulders tense. The mention of family struck a chord. Ellen's face crumpled, and she sank onto the grass, her hands covering her face. "It's my brother, miss," she confessed, her voice muffled. "Tom, in London. He's got himself in trouble. Gambling, debts, bad sorts. He writes to me, begging for money, saying they'll hurt him if he doesn't pay. But I haven't got anything to give, and I'd never steal, not even for him." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with her apron, her misery raw and unguarded. Miss Marple's heart softened, but her mind remained sharp. She recalled village gossip about Tom Carter, a charming wastrel who had left St. Mary's Mead years ago, his name whispered in connection with unsavory dealings. "That must be a heavy weight, Ellen," she said gently. "Have you told anyone else about Tom's troubles? The Colonel, perhaps?" Ellen shook her head vehemently. "No, miss, I couldn't. The Colonel doesn't hold with gambling. He'd sack me if he knew. And Tom made me promise not to tell. He says he'll sort it out, but his letters keep coming, more desperate each time." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket, its edges worn, and handed it to Miss Marple with trembling fingers. Miss Marple unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the scrawled lines. Tom's words were a mix of pleas and promises, hinting at a debt to a man named Rourke, a name that stirred a memory of a London loan shark mentioned in a past case. The letter begged Ellen for £50, a sum far beyond a maid's means. Miss Marple folded it carefully, her mind turning over the implications. Ellen's desperation was clear, but her denial of theft felt sincere. Yet the ring's value could settle such a debt and more, a temptation few could resist. "You've done right to tell me, Ellen," Miss Marple said, handing back the letter. "But you must be honest with Constable Higgs. Secrets only deepen suspicion." Her tone was kind, but her eyes held a quiet warning, and Ellen nodded, her face a mask of misery. As Miss Marple rose to return to the manor, she heard voices from the terrace. Mrs. Winthrop, her lavender dress vivid against the stone, was speaking in low tones to the Colonel, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "That girl, Ellen," Miss Marple overheard. "She's so quiet, it's unnatural. Shifty, if you ask me. A maid has access to everything, doesn't she?" Her voice was soft, almost conspiratorial, and the Colonel's frown deepened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the laundry yard. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Mrs. Winthrop's words were calculated, sowing doubt with the precision of a gardener planting seeds. The widow's charm, so freely bestowed, seemed to mask a sharper intent, and Miss Marple wondered if her accusations were meant to shield her own actions. She filed the thought away, her mind returning to Ellen's confession. The maid's brother was a clear motive, but the clean glass dome, free of fingerprints as Higgs had noted, suggested a more deliberate hand than a desperate girl's. Back in the breakfast room, the Colonel was now alone, his letter discarded on the table. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her teacup cool in her hands. "A troubling business, Colonel," she said, her voice mild. "But I'm sure the truth will out. It always does, in my experience." The Colonel grunted, his eyes still stormy. "I've half a mind to dismiss that girl," he said. "Poole's right. She had the chance, and who else would dare? But I'll wait for Higgs to finish his poking about." His tone was gruff, but Miss Marple sensed a reluctance beneath it, as if he doubted his own suspicions. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple retired to the library, a quiet room lined with leather-bound volumes and a view of the gardens. She took out her knitting, the click of her needles a soothing rhythm as she pondered. Ellen's secret was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole. Mrs. Winthrop's whispers, Mr. Poole's deflections, and the Colonel's paranoia each added a thread to the tapestry. The ring, she thought, was more than a jewel. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden desires of those around it. She would watch and listen, and the truth, as always, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 6. The Jeweler's Ambition. The library of Thornfield Manor was a sanctuary of polished oak and leather-bound books, its high windows admitting slants of midday light that fell across the Persian rug. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near a shelf of Dickens and Thackeray, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as she worked on her pink shawl. The click of the needles was a metronome to her thoughts, which turned over the morning's revelations with the care of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. Ellen Carter's confession about her brother's debts had added a new thread to the mystery of the stolen sapphire ring, but Miss Marple sensed the pattern was still incomplete. The manor, with its locked doors and simmering suspicions, felt like a stage where each player hid their true role. The door creaked open, and Mr. Edgar Poole entered, his wiry frame clad in a sober gray suit, his spectacles catching the light as he surveyed the room. He carried a small leather case, the kind used by jewelers for their tools, and his movements were deliberate, as if he were measuring the space. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but with a faint edge. "I didn't expect to find you here. Escaping the Colonel's temper, are we?" His thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild, but her gaze sharp. "Oh, Mr. Poole, I find libraries restful," she said, her needles pausing briefly. "And one can learn so much from books and people. You're here to examine the Colonel's collection, I presume?" She gestured toward his case, her tone conversational, but probing. Poole hesitated, then set the case on a nearby table, opening it to reveal a set of jeweler's tools, loops, calipers, and a small velvet cloth. "The Colonel asked me to appraise a few pieces," he said, his voice measured. "A jade figurine, some silver. He's keen to know their value, especially now, with this theft stirring things up." He extracted a loop and turned to a shelf where a small jade statuette of a crane stood, its green surface gleaming softly. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her eyes followed Poole's movements. "It's a fine piece," she said, nodding at the figurine, "though I dare say it pales beside that sapphire ring. Such a valuable item must be a great responsibility for a man in your trade." Poole's fingers paused on the figurine, and he glanced at her, his expression guarded. "Indeed," he said. "A stone like that is rare. Museum quality, really. It could fetch a fortune in the right hands." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of intensity in his eyes, as if the ring's value was more than an abstract concern. She tilted her head, her voice gentle but pointed. "You must know all sorts of buyers, Mr. Poole, in London and beyond. I've heard there are markets for such treasures, not all of them respectable. It must be tempting for a man in financial straits to consider such avenues." Her words were soft, but they hung in the air like a challenge. Poole's hand stilled, and for a moment his composure faltered, his lips tightening. "My business is sound, Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped. "I deal with reputable clients, not back-alley traders. But you're right, The ring's value would tempt anyone. That's why I suspect the maid. She's got access, and who knows what debts she's hiding." He resumed his examination of the figurine, but his movements were less steady, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his neck. She knitted on, her mind cataloging his words. Poole's quickness to redirect suspicion toward Ellen was familiar, a tactic he'd employed the previous night. Yet his mention of back-alley traders stirred a memory of a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a stolen cameo had found its way to a shady dealer in London. She probed further, her tone as light as her stitches. "I suppose a jeweler must be discreet, handling such valuable items. Have you ever had to refuse a buyer, Mr. Poole? Someone offering too much, perhaps, for the wrong reasons?" Poole's eyes narrowed, and he set the loop down with a small clink. "I've turned down offers, yes," he said. "Not every buyer has the means to pay what they promise. My shop's been in business for 20 years. I know who to trust." His words were firm, but Miss Marple detected a defensive note, as if she'd brushed against a hidden wound. She nodded, her needles clicking. "Of course. Experience teaches us whom to trust, doesn't it? Though I find people often reveal themselves in small ways, a glance, a word. Like poor Ellen, so frightened last night. I wonder if someone's using her as a convenient scapegoat." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Poole's calm wavered, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to clench. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Colonel Banbury entered, his face still etched with the previous night's fury. "Poole, have you finished with that figurine?" he barked. "I want every piece in this house accounted for. If that ring's gone, I'll not lose another." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, and he softened slightly. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not too put out by this business. It's a damned disgrace." "Not at all, Colonel," she said, her voice soothing. "These things happen, even in the best houses. I'm sure Constable Higgs will get to the bottom of it." She smiled, but her mind was elsewhere, noting the Colonel's agitation and Poole's quick recovery of his composure. The Colonel grunted, then turned to Poole. "I want your opinion on that silver candelabra in the dining room next. And no dawdling. This house is under siege until that ring's found." He strode out, leaving Poole to gather his tools, his movements brisk but not without a certain tension. Miss Marple, alone again, let her knitting fall to her lap, her thoughts racing. Poole's ambition was clear. His struggling shop, hinted at in village gossip, was a motive as old as greed itself. His knowledge of black market buyers, however casually mentioned, suggested a familiarity with less savory corners of his trade. Yet his calm demeanor during the theft's discovery was too polished, as if he'd anticipated the chaos. She recalled the clean glass dome, a detail that nagged at her. A thief in a hurry would not pause to wipe it clean, but a man like Poole, meticulous and calculating, might. As she rose to join the others for luncheon, Miss Marple's mind turned to the broader picture. Mrs. Winthrop's flirtations, Ellen's secret, and the Colonel's pride were all pieces of the puzzle, but Poole's ambition felt like a central thread. She would watch him closely, for in his guarded glances and careful words, she sensed the shadow of a plan, one that might yet unravel under her patient scrutiny. Chapter 7. The Widow's Charm. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor's morning room, casting a soft glow on the chintz upholstery and the delicate porcelain tea set arranged on a lacquered table. Miss Jane Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her eyes resting on the garden beyond, where the last roses clung stubbornly to their stems. The house, still locked under Colonel Banbury's orders, buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the sapphire ring's theft, a wound that festered with each passing hour. The morning's revelations, Ellen's desperate brother, Mr. Poole's guarded ambition, had deepened the mystery, and Miss Marple's mind, like a loom, wove the threads of suspicion into an ever-tightening pattern. The door opened with a flourish, and Mrs. Clara Winthrop swept in, her lavender morning dress exchanged for a teal afternoon gown that shimmered with understated elegance. Her auburn hair was pinned with a pearl comb, and her smile was as bright as the sunlight, though Miss Marple noted a calculated warmth in her eyes. "Miss Marple, how delightful to find you here!" Mrs. Winthrop exclaimed, settling onto a settee with the grace of a stage actress. "I've persuaded the Colonel to let us have tea together. Such a dreary day with all this suspicion hanging over us. Tea will do us good, don't you think?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of polite interest. "Most kind of you, Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her voice soft but her gaze sharp. "Tea is always a comfort, especially in trying times. This business with the ring must be quite distressing for you, being such a close friend of the Colonel's." Her words were gentle, but they carried a probing edge, and she watched as Mrs. Winthrop's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Oh, it's dreadful," Mrs. Winthrop said, pouring tea with a steady hand, the china clinking softly. "Poor Henry is beside himself, and who can blame him? That ring was his pride and joy. I keep thinking some sneak thief slipped in, but he's so sure it was someone in the house." She passed a cup to Miss Marple, her fingers brushing the saucer with a touch too deliberate. "Sugar?" "No, thank you," Miss Marple said, accepting the cup. "You mentioned the French windows last night, I believe. A clever idea, though the Colonel dismissed it. You must have been near them during the evening. Did you notice anything unusual?" Her tone was conversational, but her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, studied Mrs. Winthrop's reaction. The widow's fan, resting on the table, twitched slightly as she stirred her tea. "Oh, I was nowhere near them," she said, her laugh light but a shade too quick. "I was by the fire, talking to Henry about his campaigns. Such thrilling stories. I couldn't take my eyes off him." She leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "But that maid, Ellen, she was flitting about, wasn't she? Always so quiet, it's unnerving. I wouldn't be surprised if she's behind it all." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind noting the deflection. Mrs. Winthrop's eagerness to point at Ellen echoed Mr. Poole's accusations, but her denial of being near the windows was at odds with a detail Miss Marple had gleaned from the butler that morning. He'd seen Mrs. Winthrop adjusting a curtain near the terrace just before dinner. "Ellen does seem troubled," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Though I wonder if she's simply frightened. Servants often bear the brunt of suspicion, don't they? I recall a case in my village. A necklace went missing, and the poor housemaid was blamed until the truth came out." Mrs. Winthrop's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile remained fixed. "How dreadful," she said, setting her cup down. "But Ellen's not just frightened. She's hiding something. I saw her hands shaking when she poured the coffee last night. Guilt, if you ask me." She leaned back, fanning herself lightly, her movements graceful but calculated, as if aware of an audience. Miss Marple's needles stirred, a faint click breaking the silence. "Guilt can look like fear," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But you're right to notice such things. You seem very observant, Mrs. Winthrop. I imagine you know the Colonel's habits well, being such a frequent guest. Has he mentioned any troubles with his collection before? Debts, perhaps, or disputes?" Her question was gentle, but it landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through Mrs. Winthrop's composure. The widow's fan paused, and her laugh was a touch brittle. "Debts? Oh, Henry's far too proud for that. His collection is his life. He'd sooner part with the manor than sell a single piece. Though I suppose every collector has their worries. He did mention a disagreement with Mr. Poole over an appraisal once. Something about a vase being undervalued. But that's just business, isn't it?" She waved a hand, dismissing the topic, but Miss Marple noted the slight flush on her cheeks, as if the question had brushed too close to a truth. The conversation turned to lighter matters, village gossip, the upcoming harvest festival. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Winthrop's charm was a polished weapon, wielded to disarm and distract, but her inconsistencies were telling. Her claim of staying by the fire contradicted the butler's account, and her quickness to accuse Ellen suggested a desire to steer suspicion elsewhere. Miss Marple recalled a similar figure from her past, a widow in St. Mary's Mead, who had used her allure to mask a penchant for petty theft. Mrs. Winthrop, with her debts whispered about in the village, might have seen the ring as a solution to financial woes, or a means to secure the Colonel's favor. As they finished their tea, Mrs. Winthrop rose, her smile as bright as ever. "I must check on Henry," she said. "He's been so cross, poor dear. Do join us for cards later, Miss Marple. It might lift the mood." She swept out, leaving a faint scent of jasmine and a trail of unanswered questions. Miss Marple remained by the window, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a clock ticking down to the truth. Mrs. Winthrop's flirtations with the Colonel were no secret, but her motives were murky. Was she angling for a marriage proposal, as village gossip suggested, or was the ring's theft a bolder gambit? The clean glass dome, free of fingerprints, nagged at Miss Marple's mind, a detail too precise for a spur-of-the-moment theft. Mrs. Winthrop, with her quick glances and practiced charm, might have the cunning to orchestrate such a move, but proof was still elusive. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple joined the others in the drawing-room, where the Colonel was pacing, his temper barely contained. Mr. Poole sat by the fire, his jeweler's loupe in hand, examining a silver snuff-box with an air of distraction. Ellen, serving tea, moved with the caution of a deer in a hunter's sights, her eyes downcast. Mrs. Winthrop, now at the Colonel's side, murmured soothing words, her hand brushing his sleeve. Miss Marple, settling into her usual chair, felt the pieces of the puzzle shift. The widow's charm was a thread that might yet unravel the mystery, if only she could find the right tug to loosen it. Chapter 8. The Colonel's Pride. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study of Thornfield Manor, where Miss Jane Marple sat opposite Colonel Henry Banbury, her knitting neatly folded in her lap. The room was a fortress of masculine order, a heavy mahogany desk, shelves lined with military histories, and a glass-fronted cabinet displaying medals and a ceremonial sword. The air smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and the Colonel, seated behind his desk, exuded an authority tempered by the strain of the past 2 days. The sapphire ring's theft had left the manor under a pall, its locked doors and watchful eyes creating an atmosphere of siege. Miss Marple, invited by the colonel to discuss the case, sensed an opportunity to probe deeper into the heart of the mystery. The colonel leaned forward, his mustache bristling as he tapped a ledger on the desk. "Miss Marple, I'm a plain man, and I value plain speaking," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with weariness. "This business with the ring is intolerable. It's not just the value, though heaven knows it's worth a king's ransom. It's the principle. That ring is a piece of history, entrusted to me. I'll not have my name tarnished by a thief in my own house." His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, held a mix of pride and desperation, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped the ledger, as if anchoring himself against the storm of his emotions. "I quite understand, Colonel," she said, her voice soft but steady. "A theft in one's home is a betrayal, and such a treasure as the ring must weigh heavily on you. May I see the ledger? It might help to understand the collection's scope." Her request was polite, but her eyes were keen, searching for any clue the colonel's pride might conceal. He hesitated, then slid the ledger across the desk, its pages meticulously catalogued with descriptions of his antiques, vases, silver, paintings, and the sapphire ring, listed with a valuation that made Miss Marple's eyebrows rise slightly. "Every piece accounted for," he said, his voice swelling with pride. "I've spent decades building this collection, each item with its own story. The ring, though, that's the crown jewel, the Duchess of Claremont's scandal, her lover's tragic end. It's more than a bauble. It's a legacy." His tone was reverent, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if the legacy carried a burden. She turned the pages, her fingers tracing the entries. "A remarkable collection," she said, "though I notice the ring's insurance policy is marked as lapsed. An oversight, perhaps?" Her question was gentle, but it landed like a dart, and the colonel's face reddened, his hand tightening on the desk. "An oversight, yes," he said brusquely. "My solicitor was meant to renew it, but with all the fuss over acquiring the ring, it slipped through. Not that it matters. I'd never sell it, insured or not." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the defensive edge, as if the lapse was a sore point he preferred to avoid. She nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Of course, Colonel, a man of your standing would value the ring for its history, not its price. Though I imagine such a collection draws attention, dealers, perhaps, or even rivals. Have you had any disputes over it? Mr. Poole mentioned a disagreement about an appraisal." Her voice was mild, but her eyes watched him closely, alert for any telltale sign. The colonel's mustache twitched, and he leaned back, his chair creaking. "Poole's a sharp one, but he's no fool," he said. "We had words over a Ming vase last year. He undervalued it, in my view, to curry favor with a buyer. I sent him packing, but he's back now, all charm and expertise. I don't trust him, Miss Marple. Not with that ring." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple filed away the detail. A past quarrel could mean more than professional pride. "And Mrs. Winthrop?" she ventured, her voice still soft. "She seems very fond of you, and of your collection. Has she ever shown a particular interest in the ring?" Her question was delicate, but it probed the widow's motives, and the colonel's eyes narrowed. "Clara's a good sort," he said, though his voice held a note of caution. "She's been a friend since my wife passed, always here, cheering the place up, but she's no collector. She admires the ring, of course. Who wouldn't? But I can't see her stealing it. She's too—" He trailed off, searching for a word, and Miss Marple supplied it silently. Calculating. She closed the ledger, her mind turning over the Colonel's words. His pride in his collection was palpable, but the lapsed insurance policy suggested a man stretched thin, perhaps financially or emotionally. His distrust of Mr. Poole was telling, but his defense of Mrs. Winthrop hinted at a blindness born of flattery. And Ellen, the maid, remained the easiest target, her brother's debts a motive the Colonel seemed ready to seize upon. "Colonel," Miss Marple said, rising, "you've been most helpful. I'm sure Constable Higgs will make progress, but these things take time. In my village, I've seen how pride can blind us to the truth, but it can also lead us to it." Her words were gentle, but they carried a quiet challenge, and the Colonel's eyes met hers, a flicker of respect in their depths. As she left the study, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of possibilities. The Colonel's pride was a double-edged sword, shielding him from suspicion, but also making him vulnerable to manipulation. The lapsed insurance policy was a loose thread, suggesting either carelessness or a deeper scheme. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a stolen painting had masked a family's financial ruin. Could the Colonel, for all his bluster, be hiding a similar secret? Or was his pride merely a distraction used by another to conceal their own hand? In the corridor, she passed Mrs. Winthrop, who was arranging flowers in a vase, her teal gown a vivid splash against the manor's muted tones. "Miss Marple, you've been with Henry," she said, her smile bright but her eyes searching. "Is he any calmer? This theft has him in such a state." Her tone was sympathetic, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers lingered on the flowers, as if anchoring herself against scrutiny. "He's naturally upset," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "But he's a strong man, and pride carries one far. I'm sure the ring will turn up." She smiled, but her eyes held Mrs. Winthrop's for a moment, and the widow's smile faltered, just slightly. As Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Mr. Poole was examining a silver tray and Ellen was polishing a candlestick with nervous energy, she felt the puzzle's edges sharpen. The Colonel's pride, Mrs. Winthrop's charm, Mr. Poole's ambition, and Ellen's fear were all threads, but the pattern was not yet clear. The clean glass dome, free of fingerprints, remained a nagging detail, a sign of calculation that pointed beyond a desperate maid. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resumed, and waited for the next thread to unravel. Chapter 9. The Hidden Truth. The third day at Thornfield Manor dawned with a heavy mist that clung to the grounds, shrouding the roses and muffling the sounds of the waking household. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive, the sapphire ring's theft a festering wound that kept the manor's doors locked and its occupants on edge. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock, her eyes occasionally drifting to the window where the mist swirled like a veil over secrets. The morning's conversations with Ellen, Mr. Poole, Mrs. Winthrop, and Colonel Banbury had woven a complex tapestry of motives, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shadows of half-spoken fears and calculated words. The parlor, with its faded chintz and silver tea tray, was a hub of uneasy activity. Constable Higgs, his notebook worn at the edges, paced near the fireplace, his round face etched with frustration. His searches and interviews had yielded no ring, no clear culprit, and the pressure from the Colonel was mounting. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, in a rose-pink gown, sat at a card table, idly shuffling a deck, her smile brittle as she glanced at the others. Mr. Edgar Poole, perched on a settee, polished his spectacles with a handkerchief, his movements precise but his eyes restless. Ellen Carter, tasked with serving tea, moved with the caution of a deer in a clearing, her pale face taut with strain. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, observed them all, her mind sifting through the clues like a gardener turning soil. The clean glass dome, free of fingerprints, nagged at her thoughts. It suggested a thief with time and care, not a panicked opportunist. Ellen's confession about her brother's debts pointed to desperation, but her tearful sincerity in the garden had rung true. Mr. Poole's ambition, hinted at in his talk of black market buyers, was a sharper motive, yet his calm during the theft's discovery was too studied. Mrs. Winthrop's charm masked inconsistencies. Her claim of staying by the fire contradicted the butler's sighting near the windows. The Colonel's pride, coupled with the lapsed insurance policy, suggested a man guarding more than his collection. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the pattern was incomplete. Determined to test her suspicions, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow but purposeful. "Constable Higgs," she said, her voice gentle but carrying, "might I suggest a small experiment? It occurs to me that the thief, whoever they are, must have acted in a moment of distraction. Perhaps we could recreate that moment, to jog a memory or two." Her eyes swept the room, noting the flicker of unease in Mrs. Winthrop's smile, the tightening of Mr. Poole's jaw, and Ellen's sudden stillness. Higgs, grasping at any lead, nodded. "Right, Miss Marple. What do you propose?" She smiled, her expression one of innocent helpfulness. "Let us return to the drawing-room where the ring was taken. Have Ellen fetch a tray from there, as she did that night. It might help us see who was where and what they saw." Her suggestion was simple, but her eyes were sharp, watching for reactions. The Colonel, entering the parlor at that moment, overheard and gave a curt nod. "Do it, Higgs. I want this settled." His voice was gruff, his mustache twitching with impatience. The group moved to the drawing-room, its damask walls and velvet cushions unchanged since the theft, though the empty cushion on the rosewood table seemed to mock their efforts. Miss Marple took her usual chair by the fire, her reticule at her side, and watched as Ellen was sent to fetch a tray from the sideboard, a task mirroring her actions on the night of the theft. The maid's steps were hesitant, her eyes darting to the cushion as she passed it, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands. Mrs. Winthrop, standing near the French windows, remarked loudly, "She's nervous, isn't she?" Just like that. Night. It's suspicious, if you ask me. Her tone was light, but her eyes were calculating, and Miss Marple saw Ellen flinch, her cheeks paling. Mr. Poole, leaning against the mantel, added, "She had every opportunity. A maid's always tidying, poking about. Why not search her quarters again, Higgs?" His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the glint of intent in his gaze, as if he were eager to shift the focus. The Colonel's frown deepened, and he turned to Higgs. "Do it. Search her room, top to bottom. If she's hiding that ring, I'll have her in cuffs by nightfall." His voice was a growl, and Ellen let out a small gasp, her tray clattering slightly as she set it down. Higgs, with the butler in tow, conducted the search, returning after a tense half-hour with a single item. A letter, crumpled and tucked beneath Ellen's mattress. He held it up, his face grim. "Found this, sir, from her brother, Tom Carter, begging for money, £50, to settle a debt with some fellow named Rourke. The room fell silent, and Ellen's face crumpled, tears spilling as she sank onto a chair. "I didn't take the ring, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I kept the letter because Tom's my brother, but I'd never steal. Please, you must believe me." Her plea was raw, and Miss Marple's heart stirred with pity, but her mind remained clear. The letter was damning, but it was also convenient. Too convenient. Perhaps for someone seeking to pin the crime on Ellen. Mrs. Winthrop's fan fluttered, her lips curving in a faint smile. "Well, that's clear enough, isn't it? Debts like that would tempt anyone, even a maid." Her tone was sympathetic, but Miss Marple noted the satisfaction in her eyes, as if a rival had been neatly dispatched. Mr. Poole nodded, his spectacles glinting. "It's motive, Higgs. You'd best take her in for questioning." His voice was calm, but Miss Marple saw his fingers tighten on his handkerchief, a sign of tension beneath his composure. Higgs hesitated, his notebook open but his pencil still. "I'll need more than a letter, Mr. Poole," he said, glancing at Miss Marple as if seeking guidance. She met his gaze, her expression serene, but her mind racing. The letter confirmed Ellen's story, but its discovery felt staged, as if someone had known where to look. The clean glass dome returned to her thoughts, a detail that pointed to calculation, not desperation. "Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "might I suggest we consider the dome itself? It was wiped clean, you said. No fingerprints at all. That's not the work of a panicked thief, but someone with time to cover their tracks. Ellen was serving coffee when the ring vanished. She had no moment to wipe anything." Her words were gentle, but they shifted the room's focus, and she saw Mr. Poole's jaw tighten, Mrs. Winthrop's fan pause, and the Colonel's eyes narrow. Higgs nodded slowly. "You're right, Miss Marple. It's odd, that dome. I'll look into it." He turned to Ellen, his tone softer. "You stay here, Miss Carter. No one's arresting you yet." Ellen nodded, her tears subsiding, but her eyes remained haunted. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the empty cushion. The letter was a clue, but not the key. Someone had used Ellen's vulnerability to cast her as the villain, and the clean dome pointed to a mind more cunning than a desperate maid's. Mrs. Winthrop's accusations, Mr. Poole's deflections, and the Colonel's insistence on Ellen's guilt all circled in her thoughts. But the truth was close. She could feel it, like a stitch ready to be secured. Chapter 10. The Trap. The mist that had cloaked Thornfield Manor in the morning had burned away by late afternoon, leaving a pale sky that did little to lift the oppressive mood within. The parlor, with its chintz armchairs and silver tea tray, was a stage for restless tension, the sapphire ring's theft a wound that refused to heal. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, but her eyes were alert, scanning the room where Colonel Henry Banbury paced, his boots thudding on the rug. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, in her rose-pink gown, toyed with a fan, her smile brittle as she watched the Colonel. Mr. Edgar Poole, seated with a jeweler's loop dangling from his fingers, feigned interest in a silver cigarette case, while Ellen Carter, serving tea, moved with the wariness of a cornered animal. Constable Higgs, his notebook dog-eared from constant use, stood by the fireplace, his face a map of frustration as his investigation stalled. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, turned over the clues. Ellen's tearful confession about her brother's deaths, Mr. Poole's calculated accusations, Mrs. Winthrop's deft deflections, and the Colonel's pride, tinged with paranoia. The clean glass dome, free of fingerprints, remained a nagging detail, a sign of premeditation that pointed beyond a desperate act. The letter found in Ellen's room, damning in its plea for money, felt too neatly placed, as if someone had orchestrated its discovery to seal her guilt. The truth, Miss Marple sensed, was close, but it needed a nudge to surface, like a fish lured to the hook. She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow but deliberate. "Colonel Banbury," she said, her voice gentle but carrying, "I wonder if we might try a small ruse to shake loose the truth. In my village, I've seen how a bit of news, carefully spread, can unsettle a guilty conscience. Suppose we announce that a duplicate ring has been found in the village, perhaps at the jeweler's shop in St. Mary's Mead. It might prompt the thief to act, revealing themselves." Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, swept the room, noting the sudden stillness in Mrs. Winthrop's fan, the tightening of Mr. Poole's grip on his loop, and Ellen's sharp intake of breath. The Colonel stopped pacing, his mustache twitching as he considered her words. "A ruse, you say?" he rumbled, his eyes narrowing. "Risky, but I'm at my wits' end. Higgs, what do you think?" Higgs, caught off guard, rubbed his chin. "It's unorthodox, Miss Marple, but we've got nothing else. If you think it'll work, I'll go along." His tone was hesitant, but he nodded, deferring to her quiet authority. "Very well," the Colonel said, his voice firm. "Spread the word, Higgs. Say the jeweler in the village found a ring matching the description, dropped in the lane, perhaps. Let's see who bites." He glanced at the guests, his eyes lingering on Ellen, who paled further but said nothing. Higgs left to relay the story to the village, using the manor's telephone to call the local shopkeepers and the vicar, ensuring the news would spread like wildfire. Miss Marple, resuming her seat, watched the reactions unfold. Mrs. Winthrop laughed lightly, her fan fluttering. "What a clever idea, Miss Marple, though I can't imagine anyone here falling for it." Her words were airy, but her eyes darted to the others, as if gauging their responses. Mr. Poole adjusted his spectacles, his voice cool. "A bold move, but futile if the thief's clever enough to stay quiet. Still, I'll be curious to see what happens." His fingers toyed with the loop, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor, a crack in his usual composure. Ellen, clearing the tea tray, dropped a spoon with a clatter, her face flushed as she bent to retrieve it. I didn't take it, miss," she whispered, her eyes pleading as they met Miss Marple's. "I swear I didn't." Her voice was raw, and Miss Marple offered a reassuring nod, though her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the puzzle. As evening fell, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, the locked doors and watchful staff amplifying the sense of a trap closing. Miss Marple, claiming sleeplessness, requested permission to sit in the drawing room after dinner, her knitting a pretext for vigilance. The Colonel, distracted by his own agitation, agreed, and she settled into her familiar chair by the fire, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. The empty velvet cushion on the rosewood table seemed to pulse with the absence of the ring, a silent challenge to her plan. Earlier that day, with the Colonel's reluctant approval, Miss Marple had borrowed a paste ring from the village jeweler, a convincing replica of the sapphire, its glass stone gleaming with false promise. She had hidden it under the drawing-room sofa, tucked in a fold of fabric, where only a deliberate search would find it. The ruse was simple. If the thief believed the real ring had been found, they might check their hiding place, revealing themselves. Miss Marple, her knitting needles silent, waited in the shadows, her senses attuned to the manor's creaks and whispers. Hours passed, the clock striking midnight with a solemn chime. Then a faint sound, a soft tread on the rug, the rustle of fabric. Miss Marple's eyes, adjusted to the dimness, caught a figure creeping into the room. Ellen, her nightdress pale against the darkness, her movements hesitant but purposeful. The maid knelt by the sofa, her hands searching beneath it, and Miss Marple heard a small gasp as Ellen's fingers closed around the paste ring. She clutched it, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miss Marple rose quietly, her voice soft but firm. "Ellen, my dear, what have you found?" The words cut through the silence, and Ellen froze, the ring glinting in her hand. "Oh, miss," Ellen cried, her voice a choked whisper. "I didn't mean to. I took it, I did, but only to help Tom. I was going to give it back, I swear. I hid it in the vase, but I couldn't sell it, not really." Her words tumbled out, a flood of guilt and fear, and she sank to the floor, the paste ring falling from her fingers. Miss Marple knelt beside her, her touch gentle, but her mind racing. "Tell me everything, Ellen," she said, her voice a lifeline in the girl's despair. Ellen's story poured forth. Her brother's debts to Rourke, the loan shark, had driven her to desperation. On the night of the theft, when the colonel was distracted by Mrs. Winthrop's question, Ellen had slipped the ring into her apron, intending to borrow its value to save Tom. She had hidden it in a vase in the drawing room, planning to retrieve it later, but fear had paralyzed her, and she hadn't touched it since. Miss Marple listened, her heart stirred by pity, but her mind unyielding. Ellen's confession explained her fear, but the clean glass dome troubled her. "Ellen," she said gently, "did you wipe the dome after you took the ring? To remove your prints?" Ellen shook her head, bewildered. "No, miss, I didn't. I was too scared. I just took it and ran to the vase. I didn't touch the dome after." Her eyes were wide, and Miss Marple believed her, the girl's confusion too raw to be feigned. The old lady helped Ellen to her feet, her mind turning over the discrepancy. The clean dome suggested a second hand, someone who had anticipated suspicion and covered their tracks. Ellen's act was impulsive, driven by desperation, but the dome's condition pointed to calculation. Miss Marple's trap had caught a thief, but the larger truth remained hidden, waiting for the final thread to be pulled. Chapter 11. The Unraveling. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor was shrouded in the stillness of the early hours, the single lamp casting a faint glow over the damask walls, and the empty velvet cushion where the sapphire ring had once rested. Miss Jane Marple stood beside Ellen Carter, whose tear-streaked face was pale in the dim light, the paste ring lying discarded on the rug like a confession made solid. The maid's admission of theft, driven by her brother's desperate debts, had cracked the mystery open, but Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the dawn, sensed the puzzle was not yet complete. The clean glass dome, free of fingerprints and the calculated placement of suspicion on Ellen, pointed to a deeper scheme, one that her trap had only partially exposed. Miss Marple guided Ellen to a chair, her touch gentle, but her eyes alert. "You've been brave to tell the truth, Ellen," she said, her voice a soothing thread in the tense air. "But we must be clear on every detail. Tell me exactly how you took the ring and what happened after." Her tone was kind, but it carried the weight of quiet authority, and Ellen nodded, her hands twisting in her nightdress. "It was when the Colonel was talking to Mrs. Winthrop," Ellen whispered, her voice raw. "He was telling her about India, and everyone was listening. I was supposed to put the ring back on the cushion after Mr. Poole looked at it. I don't know what came over me, miss. I thought of Tom and how Rourke might hurt him, and I just slipped it into my apron pocket. It was so quick, I barely thought. Then I put it in the vase, the one by the bookshelves, thinking I'd get it back before anyone noticed." She pointed to a tall porcelain vase, its blue and white pattern gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Miss Marple's eyes followed her gesture, noting the vase's position, near the edge of the room, easily accessible, yet discreet. "And the dome, Ellen?" she pressed. "You didn't touch it after placing the ring on the cushion?" Ellen shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion. "No, miss, I didn't dare. I was so scared I just wanted to get away from it. I didn't wipe anything." Her sincerity was palpable, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the discrepancy. A clean dome suggested a deliberate act, not the frantic impulse of a frightened maid. Before she could probe further, the door creaked, and Colonel Banbury appeared, his dressing gown hastily tied, his face a storm of indignation. "What's this?" he demanded, his gaze falling on Ellen's tearful form and the paste ring on the floor. "Miss Marple, what's going on? Has the girl confessed?" Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "A moment, Colonel. Ellen has admitted to taking the ring, but there's more to this than meets the eye. We must call the others, and Constable Higgs. The truth is near, but it requires careful handling." Her words steadied the room, and the Colonel, though bristling, nodded and sent for the butler to rouse the household. Within the hour, the drawing-room was filled with the uneasy assembly. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, her rose-pink gown replaced by a silk robe, her fan clutched tightly. Mr. Edgar Poole, his spectacles slightly askew, his face a mask of guarded calm, and Higgs, bleary-eyed but notebook in hand, his expression one of weary determination. Ellen stood by the vase, her head bowed, while Miss Marple took her place by the fire, her reticule at her side, her mind weaving the final threads of the pattern. "Ellen has told me she took the ring," Miss Marple began, her voice clear in the hushed room, "to help her brother, who owes money to a dangerous man in London. She hid it in that vase, intending to return it. But there's a detail that troubles me. The glass dome was wiped clean of fingerprints, a task Ellen swears she did not do. That suggests another hand at work, someone who anticipated suspicion and sought to cover their tracks." Her eyes swept the room, noting Mrs. Winthrop's sudden stillness, Mr. Poole's tightened jaw, and the Colonel's furrowed brow. Higgs, scribbling in his notebook, looked up. "Another hand, Miss Marple? You mean someone else was involved?" His tone was skeptical, but he leaned forward, eager for a lead. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze settling on Mr. Poole. "Mr. Poole, you've been quick to point to Ellen, and your knowledge of gems is unmatched. You mentioned black market buyers yesterday, a curious detail for a man in a struggling shop. Tell me, did you ever speak to Ellen about the ring, perhaps suggesting a way to sell it?" Her question was gentle, but it cut through the room like a blade. Poole's composure cracked, his spectacles glinting as he stood. "That's preposterous," he snapped. "I've done nothing but help the Colonel appraise his collection. I had no part in this. His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple saw his hands tremble, a telltale sign of strain. Ellen, her voice trembling, spoke up. "He did talk to me, miss, a week ago, in the village. He asked if I ever saw the Colonel's jewels up close, said a girl like me could make a fortune with the right buyer. I thought he was joking, but—" She trailed off, her eyes wide with realization. The Colonel's face reddened. "Poole, you blackguard, what's this about buyers?" He strode toward the jeweler, who stepped back, his calm unraveling. "I only meant to help her," Poole protested, his voice rising. "She was worried about her brother. I thought I could connect her with someone, that's all. I never touched the ring." His words were desperate, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the lie in his too quick denial. She turned to Higgs. "Constable, might you search Mr. Poole's luggage? A jeweler's tools are precise, and a man planning to sell a stolen ring might carry something to conceal it." Her suggestion was soft, but it carried the weight of certainty. Higgs, with the butler's assistance, searched Poole's room and returned with a small leather case, its contents spilling onto the table. A loop, calipers, and a velvet pouch with a hidden compartment. Empty, but perfectly sized for a ring. The room gasped, and Poole's face paled, his hands clenching. "I can explain," he stammered, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice steady. "You saw Ellen's desperation, Mr. Poole," she said. "You encouraged her to take the ring, promising to handle the sale, knowing she'd be too frightened to act alone. You planned to retrieve it from the vase, but her hesitation delayed you. The clean dome was your work, wasn't it, to ensure no trace led back to you?" Her words were calm, but they pinned Poole like a specimen under glass. He slumped, his defiance crumbling. "I needed the money," he admitted, his voice low. "My shop's failing, debts piling up. I thought Ellen would take the blame, and I'd slip away with the ring. But I didn't get it. She never gave it to me." His confession hung in the air, a stark admission of greed. Mrs. Winthrop's fan snapped shut, her eyes wide but gleaming with relief, as if a shadow had lifted from her. The Colonel's fury turned to Poole, his voice a roar. "You'll answer for this, Poole." Higgs, notebook forgotten, stepped forward to restrain the jeweler. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vase. "Constable," she said, "perhaps you should check the vase Ellen mentioned." Higgs, with a nod, tipped the vase carefully, and a glint of sapphire tumbled onto the table. The real ring, its deep blue heart catching the lamplight. Ellen sobbed, her relief palpable, and Miss Marple's heart softened, though her mind remained clear. The trap had caught two thieves, Ellen's impulsive act and Poole's calculated scheme. The truth, as always, had surfaced under her patient scrutiny. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, bathed in the pale light of a late autumn morning, was a tableau of relief and reckoning. The sapphire ring, its deep blue heart gleaming on the rosewood table, lay reclaimed from the porcelain vase where Ellen Carter had hidden it, a silent testament to the unraveling of a tangled plot. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her reticule at her side, her eyes calm but piercing as she surveyed the assembled company. Colonel Henry Banbury, his fury now tempered by the ring's recovery, stood with arms crossed, his mustache still bristling with indignation. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, her rose-pink gown a vivid contrast to her subdued expression, clutched her fan tightly, as if anchoring herself against the storm's aftermath. Mr. Edgar Poole, his spectacles askew and his face ashen, sat under Constable Higgs's watchful eye, his confession of greed hanging heavy in the air. Ellen Carter, her cheeks blotched with tears, stood by the vase, her head bowed but her shoulders lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Miss Marple, her voice soft but carrying the weight of truth, addressed the room. "The ring has been found, and with it, the truth," she began, her gaze moving from one face to another. Ellen, in a moment of desperation for her brother's sake, took the ring, intending to borrow its value to settle his debts. She hid it in the vase, overcome by fear and unable to act further. But another hand was at work, one more calculating, one that saw her vulnerability and used it. Her eyes settled on Mr. Poole, who flinched, his hands clenching in his lap. Constable Higgs, his notebook open but unused, nodded for her to continue, his respect for her insight evident. The colonel, his anger now focused, glared at Poole, while Mrs. Winthrop's fan slowed, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and the jeweler. "Mr. Poole," Miss Marple continued, her tone measured but unrelenting. "You knew of Ellen's brother's troubles, perhaps from village gossip or a chance remark. A week ago, you spoke to her in St. Mary's Mead, planting the idea that a girl like her could profit from the colonel's jewels. You saw an opportunity, a struggling shop, debts mounting, and a ring worth a fortune. You encouraged Ellen to take it, promising to handle the sale through your less reputable contacts, knowing she'd be too frightened to act alone. When she hid the ring, you planned to retrieve it from the vase, but her hesitation thwarted you." She paused, letting her words sink in, and saw Poole's shoulders slump, his defiance drained. "The clean glass dome," she added, "was your work, Mr. Poole. No fingerprints, no trace, too careful for a panicked maid, but perfect for a jeweler accustomed to precision. You wiped it to ensure suspicion fell on Ellen, not you. The letter in her room, so conveniently found, was likely your doing as well, placed to seal her guilt." Her voice was gentle, but it cut through the room, and Poole's head dropped, his silence a confession. Ellen, her voice trembling, spoke up. "It's true, miss. He talked to me about buyers, said it'd be easy money for Tom. I was so scared I didn't think straight, but I couldn't go through with it. I hid the ring and left it there." Her tears fell anew, but her eyes held a flicker of relief, as if the truth had freed her from a cage. The colonel's face reddened, his voice a roar. "Poole, you scoundrel, using my maid to steal my ring, my legacy." He took a step toward the jeweler, but Higgs raised a hand, his authority bolstered by the moment. "Easy, sir," Higgs said. "Mr. Poole, you'll come with me. We'll sort this out at the station." He gestured to the butler who stood ready to assist, and Poole rose, his movements mechanical, his ambition reduced to ashes. Mrs. Winthrop, her fan now still, spoke with a forced brightness. "How dreadful, Henry, to think such a plot was under your roof. Thank heavens for Miss Marple's cleverness." Her smile was strained, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Ellen's, as if distancing herself from the drama. The widow's flirtations and accusations, while not criminal, had played their part in muddying the waters, and Miss Marple suspected her motives, perhaps a bid for the colonel's favor, were not entirely pure. The colonel turned to Ellen, his expression softening, though his voice remained stern. "You've been a fool, girl, but I see you meant no lasting harm. If you'll stay on and prove your loyalty, I'll not press charges, but mind you, no more secrets." His words were gruff, but they carried a hint of mercy, and Ellen nodded, her tears slowing as she murmured her gratitude. Miss Marple, her task complete, gathered her reticule and stepped toward the door. "The ring is safe, Colonel, and the truth is out," she said. "It's often the small things, greed, fear, loyalty, that unravel the grandest schemes." Her smile was gentle, but her eyes held a quiet triumph, the puzzle solved as neatly as a finished shawl. As she left the drawing room, the manor's heavy air seemed to lift, the locked doors soon to open. Outside, the autumn sky was clear, and Miss Marple walked the gravel path to St. Mary's Mead, her thoughts already turning to her cottage, her roses, and the comforting click of her knitting needles. The sapphire ring, with its tales of scandal and betrayal, had revealed the frailties of those around it. Ellen's loyalty to her brother, Poole's greed, Mrs. Winthrop's ambition, and the Colonel's pride. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, was the true mystery, and she had solved it once again.